Hello, Audrey. Where in the world are you and where are you headed?
Hi, David. So right now I'm in chilly Vermont and I'm headed down to slightly warmer Connecticut for the Thanksgiving celebrations with Mark's family. How about you?
Well, I'm in a very different place wearing my t-shirt and flip-flops. So I'm looking out the balcony to a giant bamboo tree here in Bangkok, enjoying wonderful weather. It's cooled down a little bit, so that means it's in the upper 80s for Fahrenheit folks. And I'm headed to Koh Samet in another week to begin more exploration. And this connects back to all the days that we were in Saudi that we would take these big trips to Thailand, so many families. So I've been coming here for years, but it's nice to be here semi permanently.
I am envious, I'll be honest with you. So let's talk about why we're doing this episode. We are excited to share with our listeners what we think are three helpful tools: a blog post, a Google Doc, and a spreadsheet that will help answer the following guiding question. When looking at recruiting, how can educators more intentionally compare schools, host cities, and countries that pique their interest?
Our approach to this episode is going to be to walk you through the criteria that you can use to measure the different schools, the different cities, and the countries that you're looking at for your next move. We're going to highlight some of these criteria and give you a taste of what you can find in the blog post. And we really, really encourage you to read the blog post. It's long, but it's going to be a really beneficial tool for you. We can also see educators putting their recruiting plan together using our information to help them rate the criteria that they seek in their next school, city, and country. We think a valuable part of this plan is to list what you want in your next location, really looking at your priorities. So if you're single, just sitting down with yourself and just contemplating what are the main driving criteria that you want out of your next school, and then use our tool to choose the ones that are going to really drive your process and get them down in black and white. That can really help you with schools that you are looking for, but also to put a list of no-go criteria, things that if they're really rating highly for potential schools, cities, and countries, that you're not going to apply to those schools, or if you get an offer, you might say no.
Right. And we've all been there. You get the interview and you get excited about a school, and maybe they're selling it hard. It's tempting to decide and jump in without carefully considering factors that you know would or would not make that school a good match for you. So, a written plan makes it easier to stick with what you know will work best for you. And we say this knowing that recruiting and choosing your next school won't get you 100% of your wish list. Compromise and flexibility are part of the process, but within some considered limits.
A second way to use the tools is to help you proactively research each school before you even begin recruiting. So you've put your wish list together, you're starting your recruiting, and what we're saying is pull from that our criteria to find out what you want to get answers to. You're going to go to the school website, you're going to reach out to your network, and you can go to our library resource page to start gathering information to answer the criteria questions. So that's the point. When you look at these criteria, they're listed as questions for you to try to find the answers. So when you're using your list, you're putting it together. It will also help you develop a list of questions, the ones that you cannot answer, that when you do interview, that you can ask the administrators on the other side of the table or the virtual table those questions to gather more information.
Yeah, and it's always good to have some questions ready to ask during an interview because often the recruiter's going to ask, do you have any questions for us? And it's good to have some ahead of time. So this is a nice way to pull out some of those questions. Hey, I wasn't able to find out information about blank, and can you tell me more? So that's great. A third way to use the tools is to fill in the spreadsheet with schools that you've gotten offers from, and then go through the process of ranking the criteria that you've got information on. Then look at the final tallies on the spreadsheet for each school as a way to kind of quantify your comparisons.
So there are three ways to use this tool. First is the blog post with the full information for you to read through, maybe a couple times to get a feel for all the different criteria. Second, there's a Google Doc with the same criteria. It has a table of contents, drop-down menus. So what you do is you make a copy of it and then you start manipulating it. Maybe some of the criteria you want to take out, there's certain ones that you want to keep. And finally, there's a spreadsheet to copy and then do the same thing, edit it for your purposes.
Before we dive into some of the specific criteria that you'll find in the tools, we've invited Mark Forgeron, who helped us design and then create the spreadsheet, to join us to explain his spreadsheet scoring design and how it functions. We suggest you have the spreadsheet open so you can follow along as Mark goes through it. So now would be the time to pause and open the spreadsheet. Over to you, Mark.
Thank you, Audrey, and of course, David. Yeah, the spreadsheet is just a tool to help you to compare different schools of which you have some interest, whether you are already been offered something from the school or you're just doing some research. We've kind of broke it down into really 5 school criteria and then 2 more, one for the city in which the school is and the country. So really you're going to get 7 totals from 7 different spreadsheet pages that will then propagate the main page to give you an overall total score for your school. If you look at, maybe click on the first tab, the one that says school, curriculum/job. And in there, there's room for doing 4 schools at a time. You could always add more or narrow it down to only 2. But there's different questions about the specific job you might be doing for that school. So it goes into the curriculum, the job description and opportunities for you at the school, responsibilities as your teacher, and every subline has a score from 0 to 5, 0 being low and 5 being high. You want to put an entry in for each one because if you don't, 0 is a default. So put an entry from 1 to 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever you would rate that particular line item in that description for the school in which you're evaluating. When you get all done your column for your school number 1, for example, there will be a total that appears in the bottom. If you go back to the main original page of the scoring totals, that total is now propagated on line 1 for total score of school curriculum/job. But if you go now and do the next 6 of these, the one for salary benefits, then for governance, for programs facilities, for extra, and lastly for city and country, you're going to get 6 more subtotal scores that will propagate the main page for an overall total of 7 scores being summed up for your school's score. That's going to be down in line 15, the overall total score. Now, there is, if you go back to, let's go maybe the second category page for the salary and benefits. If you don't have an exact idea of what it's going to be, do a bit more research and make your best estimate, because again, if you leave it blank, it's going to give an awful low score. But as you go down every page, including this one, if you scroll down to the bottom of this page, you'll see at the very end, there's kind of the X factor. So if this is a particular job that you want to maybe fudge it a little bit, or it's really high in your list for different reasons, you can give it a few more points here just so the overall total score gets upped a bit, like you're grading on a curve almost. Okay, so that last line item in each page will be added to the summary total of that page to make it a little bit higher. And so when it propagates back to the original scoring totals page, you'll have a higher score.
So what might be an X factor for you?
Well, for me, if I look at all the schools that I've taught in over my nearly 40-year career, I like the warm weather and I like to be near the equator. So if I'm looking at schools and one's going to be a warm weather school, that's more of an X factor for me to rate a little bit higher than a place that gets a long and dark, cold winter. And I would score that one a bit lower for that reason.
Hence why we lived at the equator for almost 30 years.
Exactly.
So one more question. What if there's a criterion for which I can't find the answer, or maybe I just want to eliminate it, doesn't matter to me at all? What if, I'm someone who's single, right? So I'm looking at the second tab here, the salary benefits tab, and trailing spouse doesn't apply to me. Could you maybe address that? What would I do?
Well, you have made your own copy, so you could delete some lines off if you wanted to. And presumably that would be true for every school you're comparing, so you wouldn't need those lines for any of the schools. And therefore, it would balance off your totals when you're adding down. If you left it blank and add zeros, again, it'd be the same for all the other schools. So it would not skew the score for one particular school if you were treating it the same way for every school in the comparison. You can put some comments in for each of the lines if you want to. So you can add comments for a field. Maybe that's where you want to add a comment.
Okay. But as far as the overall scores, the score for each page isn't the same or anything like that, right? The scores aren't out of a total score, right? It's just a score relative to each other school. So if I was to eliminate, lines 24 through 27 on the school salary benefits tab, my overall score will be lower, but it'll be also out of fewer possible total points. Is that right?
Yes, it's not going to affect the overall view that you have of the schools. You'll still get the same relative weighting for all the schools you're comparing because it's the same category that you've eliminated for each school.
So just to make sure I understand, for example, if I don't have an X factor for any of the schools, for example, under school program, I don't have an X factor, that's okay because it's just a comparison of one school to another. So if I completely ignore a particular criterion, it's going to affect each school the same way.
Yes, correct.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for coming on and for explaining the scoring system of your wonderful spreadsheet, and also, of course, for working on and creating the spreadsheet and coming up with the scoring system. I think it's going to be a really helpful tool for people to help objectify their decision. Do you have anything else you want to mention at this point?
No, I think once you get your totals, and it's just a tool, and sometimes it comes down to just a gut feeling when you get all done and two schools are very close in score, you have to find a way to separate the school you really want to be at. And sometimes a spreadsheet and just your raw analytical data won't tell you that. So sometimes it comes in the end, once you have all your data, your comparisons, you're just saying, okay, they're so close, they're so even. What do I really feel like doing in my gut?
Right. So it might help you to objectify the process somewhat, and yet you still may decide that there's a school that's just really calling to your heart and go with that one. And that's all good too. Thanks so much, Mark.
Okay, you're welcome.
We're going to treat this like we do any other show. We've got our guiding question and then our supporting questions. The way we're going to do this is each of us has selected some criteria that speak to us, and we're going to take turns fleshing them out a little bit. So, David, why don't you start us off under the category of schools?
Yes. So one of the criteria is it a startup? And a startup has definite pros and cons to think about. And what we keep hearing about is just more and more new schools are being built. So there's a possibility that you might end up at a startup. So one of the things that comes to my mind in answering that question is, when did the leadership team form, and when did they begin designing the structures and systems that would need to be in place to start school on day one? And for your kind of angle on this, what might be additional work for you, but also what might be additional opportunities where you could be moving into leadership, program development? So there are definite opportunities, but the big part is you want to make sure the systems and structures have a chance to be placed, and it makes just the start of the year and the first year go much smoother. Audrey, how about you?
Well, I was going to say that it depends on the person. Some people are going to welcome the opportunity to be part of all that development and, as you say, to take on some leadership roles. And other people might be frustrated that things are not already in place. So thinking about that, there's different ways to look at it. My next one I wanted to look at is community cohesion. And to me, one of the biggest joys of being an international educator is connections, and knowing that a school community feels like a family, does activities together. For me, that's a draw. How involved is the PTO? How active are the parents? And then David did a great blog post asking, are you a traveler or a tourist? And as a traveler, you're someone that probably wants to make inroads into the host community. So it might be nice if you find out ahead of time that there are people who are already active in the local community in a variety of ways. If you approach this lifestyle as a tourist, then you would want to make sure that the school was the community and that a lot of the activities centered around the school. Maybe you're someone who wants to have both opportunities. It's just something that I think is important to consider, especially if you're like myself and connection is such a key part of what you love. How about you, Dave?
Yeah, that one is a huge one because just as you said, there's the school community, and then there's the reaching out into the broader expatriate community that you can be involved in. And one of the things that's so cool is many schools on the weekends offer activities where the families come out. Some of them are special events, some of them are like every weekend sporting events for the children. And so some of these schools have whole departments running these weekend programs, and that brings everyone together on a weekly basis. So that's huge. I can say that one of my schools didn't have it, and I could definitely see how there was not a kind of a merging of all the different family groups, and it was a loss. So definitely look for that. I see it as a big positive. All right. So that really kind of connects to my next criterion. So let me go ahead and share that. So is there a co-curricular department that has curriculum, resources, and leadership? And if you haven't heard that term co-curricular, I remember a head of school that I was working with back in 1999. He used that term instead of extracurricular because I think for a lot of us, extra means just an add-on. It isn't as important. But co-curricular means these programs that start usually at the end of the school day are definitely connected to the mission, the regular classroom curriculum. So I think that's really, really important. One of the big things we talk about is the whole child in the whole community. So for me, it makes sense to prioritize and promote activities and programs that all connect to the regular goings on, the academic program, and they're not seen as an extra. So in my mind, it would be a big plus if you're looking at a school that has a co-curricular department. Maybe they call it the activities department that has dedicated leadership and connections to the mission and the curriculum.
Definitely. Those co curricular activities also offer a wonderful opportunity for teachers to get to know the kids in a completely different way. So, strongly recommend those as well. Another one I want to talk about is DEIJ. And you could look at things like how diverse is the faculty and the student population, and where do they stand on DEIJ as a school? Have they got policies in place? Is it something they are talking about? Do people feel included? And how much time and energy are they putting into developing a plan for working on improving diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice? To me, that's an indicator of a quality school, would be a school that is aware of this and is really working to, as Tim Stewart would say, look at the problem head on and approach it mindfully. And, he would also say, remember, you don't really know anything about this, so have an open mind and a beginner mindset towards it. So DEIJ, I think, is really important to look at.
That connects to several of our guests who said this is a huge trend and so many schools are working on it. And I've got a point to share. Just yesterday, I received an email from a friend who's not an American, and she's applying to a school. And right on their website, it says, you must be an American to apply at our school. And I said to her, I said, boy, everything I'm reading is, we're getting away from that. So that was very interesting. We'll see how long that school can continue to do that. All right. So another area of schools is what are the languages or what is the language that's spoken in the hallway? These international schools, our audience mainly are English speakers, but we might have some people that work at French schools or German schools or Japanese schools, Korean schools. There's so many. But what is the language when you walk out of your classroom? What is the language that's being spoken there? And so while it can be interesting to hear many languages outside of the classroom, if the language of instruction is not the language in the hallways, the door to inclusion and shared experience can close to some degree. And there can be some potential problems. So that's something to dig into. So I've worked at a couple schools where the policy was for English to be spoken inside and outside the classroom, but because the host country language was used so much, that was not the case. The reality was different, with the host country's language being spoken outside of the class, which led to enforcement issues, and the international students like my sons who didn't speak the local language, sometimes feeling isolated and excluded.
Yeah, that was my daughter's experience in one of the schools we were in as well. And she felt that these were cliques, and I was suggesting that it probably wasn't intentional. The locals had been at school since kindergarten, and so they just all were really close friends. She really felt that they were not open to new people coming in. So that can be an issue too, for sure. And I think it's a really tough one for a school to stay on top of. So my next one is profile and retention of faculty. And again, this speaks to the idea of diversity, but also the level or degree of turnover, also known as churn in the business world. So, what is the churn rate and average tenure? And to me, that is a really big indicator of a school where people are happy, where people are heard, morale is good, the administration is solid, systems are in place, and so on. I will add one little caveat that it might vary by division. There were schools where I taught in a different division from my husband, and he was frustrated with the admin, and I thought it was great. So, that's a factor too in a bigger school. But by and large, I think that that kind of culture really speaks volumes for the quality of a school.
That also gets at what we call like the golden handcuffs. There are
Right.
some schools that the package is so good that people come and just stay forever. I was explaining to a friend about one of the schools in the Middle East that's just known for people landing and staying for 20, 30 years and such. And then we've heard from one of our guests about some European schools that people just love Europe, and so they come for a long, long time. And what can happen there unless there are really systems in place to revitalize, constantly look at what can we do differently, how can we sharpen the saw, things can get a little stale, and people can, back to what you were saying, cliques, can kind of get in their cliques a little bit and say, this is the way we do things, new administrator. We're not going to be open to change. So that's something to watch. So hopefully you're getting a feel for how complex some of these different criteria are. There's no easy answer, but the point is just to dig a little deeper, get more information. All right, so if you are new looking at coming overseas, you're going to hear two terms that you've heard before, but let me go ahead and define them a little bit. One is onboarding and one is orientation. So onboarding happens after you get the job, and then the HR department begins the process of sharing what documents you've got to get prepared. You probably get a buddy. There's probably a lead teacher who connects you and all your other new people coming in. So you begin the process of learning about the school and the city. That goes on through the spring, taking a North American perspective, through the summer, and then orientation starts. And that's really getting you comfortable with the school. How are things going to work? And once you land, that's the solid time of getting oriented to your new school. What kind of in the past is orientation would often end the first day of school, but now more and more schools are continuing that orientation because you're learning new things once you start teaching and living in that city. So it's a big bonus to look for schools that say our orientation is going to go on throughout the school year. So keep your eye open for that.
One school I was at provided local language lessons for new teachers for a couple of months after you had arrived. And I thought that was just wonderful. I really appreciated that. For example, so that leads nicely into my next point, which is to think about wellness. And the pandemic brought this notion maybe a bit more to the fore, that wellness of both faculty and students and administration really is so key to running an effective school program. When people are not feeling comfortable in their environment, it's hard for them to sustain teaching that's quality, learning that's quality, and quite frankly, leading that's quality. And when schools have that as an overt focus, things certainly go a lot better. when they look at student programs and how can wellness be integrated, when they look at support for staff and have a more flexible policy around work-life balance, when parents are involved and also receive support from the school. In fact, remember Heather Narrow talked about the board receiving instruction on how to be a board member. Things like that can really make things work more smoothly when you look at the full picture of wellness. And one part of that picture as well that, again, the pandemic brought to the fore, digital wellness, and to what extent are students on their devices all day long, every day, at school, at home, and not having social interactions human to human. And that's a major factor. And then also the whole digital citizenship idea, where when you're anonymously posting, it's pretty easy to start to get mean. And that can happen a lot. And that can be devastating for the target of such bullying. So having a school wellness plan, and, even if David has his druthers, you'd hire a school wellness coordinator whose function was to look at wellness throughout the school, holistic wellness, and see where improvements could be made everywhere. So, David, you want to talk about that a little bit?
Wow, you really covered that well, partner. So nice job. As we know, if you want a program to work, you need to have a leader. So yes, having an overall coordinator and potentially within each division, and they probably won't have this, as a wellness coach along with a counselor. Probably it's a merging of the two as I look at the job openings. I'm seeing some wellness coaches, but they're like 30%, and then they're 40% counseling, and they're 30% academic support. So, we're getting there. It's taking some time. The big thing, and you just hit on it, is to ask for that documentation, because this is another big trend that's occurring right now. And schools can have great aspirations about wellness, and they can have a lot of info on their website about it. But this is one to try to dig down and find out really how are they implementing it. Audrey just used the term integrating it. And that would be if you can find out if it's being integrated into the regular curriculum in the middle school and high school, if it's part of the advisory program, if they have a handbook or if they have a portal, whatever, get hold of that and then have some questions to say, what does it look like for a third grader who's learning if they're doing positive psychology? What might they say to me if I ask them some questions about their wellness? Same thing for middle school, same thing for high school. So that's a biggie. Definitely look into it.
Yeah, and if you land at a school that is considering putting in some wellness, I highly recommend going to David's blog post where he talks about and links in his wellness website that he put together. It's an elementary school focused wellness program, but a lot of it could be applied to the upper levels. So, really recommend that resource. So, those are a few of the criteria around schools in particular. Let's shift to our next kind of broader category of cities. David, you want to start?
Definitely. All right. So, a big question you might not think very much about because you're thinking so much about the school is the city. This is where you're going to be living. So, one of the criteria is how beautiful or possibly unappealing is the city. So, it's a given that some cities have little charm, maybe with not a lot of historical heritage because maybe there wasn't a lot there, and the government just built this city up from scratch. There are places like that. Some have shanty towns and limited infrastructure. That could be poor roads, limited sanitation, like when you get big rains, the wash off from that, for example. So for me, this is high on my list. And I have a passion for old. I have a passion for character and charm. And you can find that even in modern cities. So when I lived in Hong Kong, you could definitely go over to Kowloon and find cool alleyways and interesting shops and such. So this really does show my bias. So there are super modern cities that have been built from scratch, or they've just torn down what was there before, that have no historical architecture. And then you kind of get into the restaurant scene, and often it can be Western franchises, maybe some European, but you don't find those mom and pop restaurants. And that, in my case, would be pretty negative. And so my bias, having lived in Saigon and now Bangkok, and Audrey, you know this, are walking down side alleys and finding metal tables and plastic chairs and a little cart where the person's cooking. So that, to me, that adds so much character to living in a city overseas.
Oh my goodness, you just reminded me of an amazing meal that my family and I had at a restaurant called The Junk in Kaching in Malaysia. And the restaurant was full. We didn't have a reservation. It was New Year's Eve. That was our fault. We begged and pleaded, and they squeezed us in. And the meal was amazing, but we sat, like you said, on plastic chairs out in a street where there was construction going on and everything. But it was just so amazing. What a great opportunity. Thanks for bringing back that little memory. Well, I have one opportunity to talk about another factor that would make you perhaps consider a city or shy away from it. And I kind of cheating here, I chose the one called quality of city life because that kind of covers a lot of the criteria, which includes, as David mentioned, infrastructure as well as governance. What's the political situation in the city look like and how would that affect you? Pollution levels. Safety can be a big factor, though, quite honestly, any big city is going to have safety issues somewhere. So often it's just about learning to be smart and keep yourself safe, be aware of what's around you, not go to certain places at certain times. So you can get kind of the inside scoop on that from people who've been there. Weather, you may or may not have thought about it. I remember getting the offer to go to Singapore, and it was interesting because I was excited about going to this exotic place that I actually had to look up on the map. I didn't really know exactly where it was. I had a rough idea. And the offer came as an email, and it was Alan Brady, and he said, "So, do you want to come and live in the tropics?" And I suddenly said, "Oh, wow, tropics. That's going to mean a lot of humidity and a lot of rain." And I really had to think about it. When we first got there, honestly, for the first 5 or 6 weeks, all it did was rain. And I just thought to myself, I guess this is just how it is here, and I'm just going to have to resign myself to this. And thankfully, not long after I sort of had that moment, it started to clear up, and then it was sunny every day. So it was just a coincidence that our first year there, the first month or so, was just rain, heavy rain every day. But it got better. And, it was a great school, and really the weather wasn't a huge factor. So, and then healthcare. Healthcare is huge, and we've really been blessed to have excellent healthcare. Well, Ethiopia, okay, that was a little bit dodgy. I mean, that was 30 years ago too, but they had a Swedish clinic that you would go to for your more minor things. And then if you were more seriously injured or ill, you would be medevac to Nairobi, which some people would say, ah. And if it was really bad, they would take you all the way to Frankfurt, Germany. So that was what Thai Care was covering in Ethiopia. But every other place, Saudi Arabia, fantastic healthcare. Singapore, amazing healthcare. Chile, fantastic. Italy, awesome. Even Senegal. Senegal, the doctors made house calls. So it was pretty incredible. Yeah, loved it. And in Jamaica, I just had amazing healthcare experiences. So I feel like for the most part, these cities have pretty good healthcare. What's been your experience, David?
It's definitely been the case. And here in Thailand, watching YouTube and going on Reddit, so many people talk about that you really don't use your insurance very much because the costs are so low for minor things. But like you said, for major things, then we get into the whole idea of healthcare tourism, dentistry tourism. So hopefully for folks who are new looking overseas, that can make them feel a little bit more comfortable that so many of these countries have solid healthcare, private healthcare, and many of them have public healthcare as well, which is a good reminder of really looking at what the insurance will cover for your school. And we've spoken about this, and I think we've got a blog post because more and more schools are offering that coverage within your country, but they are not covering you when you leave. Like if you go back to your home country or take a holiday, you've got to get travel health insurance. So that's just a reminder on that topic. And I do want to add, so these are subtopics that we put in under the kind of global quality of city life, but you'll come up with more. What are the subtopics that are really factors that are most important to you? Because this is one of the biggest of the criteria for you to take a look at. All right, Audrey, let's shift to countries now. And just for our listeners, we've got plenty of factors for you to look at for city and country, but we're just going to cover one each. So what about countries, Audrey?
Well, the one I chose to talk a little bit about is values. Does this country's political scene match with your values? What about corruption? For example, some people I know, David, I don't remember if this was your experience in Panama, that it was not infrequent to have to pay bribes when you were out and
Oh,
about.
yeah.
Yeah, same in Ethiopia, I know for sure. And, if it bothers you, if there are human rights issues in the country where you're living, what are the freedoms in the country where you're living? And how do you feel about that? Or will you feel terrible? Also, there's some countries where you are going to pass people on the street every day who are not in a great living situation. And how are you going to handle that? So, those are some things to think about in terms of your values.
Definitely a big topic. That's probably a very good one to start with when you're step one, sitting down. How are you going to be in congruence or not with how that country is being run? So that's a big topic. So for me, getting down into the weeds a bit and loving diving into local culture and going to public festivals, this is one that you might not think very much about. You might just hear about these incredible public festivals that take place in this country that you're looking at. I want to kind of bring up the point that can you go to them? Because what I've experienced in at least two countries, when they have a public holiday that might incorporate festivities or it's just a public holiday, I found that we really couldn't travel. It was just the roads were too crowded. You wanted to go out to the beach if you were near the water, or you wanted to go to the mountains, or you wanted to actually go to that festival. There were cases where there were just so many people back to the infrastructure, everything's connected. The infrastructure did not support going to these events or getting out of the city. So what happened is we had fewer travel opportunities. So this can be a real big one for folks to look into, but you might have other criteria that really outweigh this one. And you just say, okay, it's a 3-day weekend. I'm going to enjoy my condo, the pool, the tennis court, whatever. It might not be as big for you. So do your research for how accessible cultural events are regarding transportation, to go to them, to go outside the city. This might be a big choice for some of you. And there are, of course, countries that have terrific infrastructure. They really plan ahead for these events. And that also gets into public safety. I was traveling in one country and just walking across town to go to a jazz club. And we ran into a massive concert. And I stopped traveling. I just stopped at that moment and said to my friend, this is dangerous. These people are so packed together. And we've all heard about the terrible events during concerts when they don't have ways for people to exit very well. So that was a big eye opener for me. So definitely look into this if culture and of course travel are important to you.
Right. Absolutely true. Good point about the concert. And, not everywhere has the same kind of standards that you might be used to, where there's security, the exits are carefully vetted, the fire marshal has put limits on how many people can be there, and so on. So that is a really good point. Well, I think we've presented a few criteria to you to kind of get you going and give you the flavor of what this blog post, Google Doc, and spreadsheet are all about. And the name of it is Profiling Schools, Cities, and Countries. And our aim is to convince you to read the post and review how the spreadsheet works. Thanks again to Mark for putting in the scoring on it. And he really put in a lot of effort on that to make it tally, a final tally for you on that first page. We did our best to list as many criteria as possible without going overboard, with the understanding that some might not be important for everyone. We definitely threw the proverbial kitchen sink at you. We'd love to hear your feedback on improving current criteria, and maybe if you have some criteria that we missed that you'd like for us to add to the tools. Please email us your thoughts at educatorsgoingglobal@gmail.com, or better yet, join our Educators Going Global Facebook page and find our post about this episode where you can use the comment tool to share your insights.
Thank you for joining us today on Educators Going Global.
You can find this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and all the other usual suspects.
Please subscribe, like us, and leave a review on Apple and Spotify, and let your teaching friends know about us so we can grow our community.
Please reach out at educatorsgoingglobal@gmail.com and join our Facebook group, Educators Going Global, if you have ideas, comments, or wish to share a Going Global story of your own.
You can also find us on Instagram at Educators Going Global.
Please visit our website as well, www.educatorsgoingglobal.com. All our podcast episodes are on there by topic, along with blog posts, Going Global stories, and our ever-growing resource library. For now, this is Audrey
And David.
inviting you to travel,
Teach.
and connect with us.